The sun was slowly setting behind the tall stone walls of the old convent, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. Inside, the corridors were quiet except for the faint rustle of habits brushing against the floor and the gentle hum of evening prayers. Among the group of elderly nuns moving through the hallway was an old woman with kind eyes and slow steps. She had lived in this convent for nearly her entire life, teaching children, tending the gardens, and caring for those who came seeking peace. Her name was Sister Agnes, and though she seemed ordinary to those who met her, there was something hidden deep within her heart that few people knew. Many years ago, before she had taken her vows, music had been her world. She had once spent long hours at a piano, practicing until her fingers hurt, letting melodies pour out of her like prayer. But time had changed everything. Life in the convent was simple and full of service. The piano that had once stood proudly in the chapel had grown old and silent, its keys yellowed and its strings rusted. Dust covered the lid and no one had played it for years. Every time Sister Agnes passed that piano, she felt a small ache in her heart. She would stop for a moment and gently run her hand along the wood. Sometimes she would whisper a little prayer, thanking God for the gift of music that had once been part of her life. Yet she never complained, nor did she tell anyone about the years she had spent studying and playing when she was young. To most people, she was simply the quiet old nun who always smiled and helped others. One morning, excitement spread through the convent. A small group of young musicians was visiting from the nearby city. They were coming to perform a charity concert to raise funds for a local children's hospital. The sisters were thrilled. It wasn't often that music filled the convent halls anymore, and everyone wanted to help prepare. The visitors arrived carrying shiny instruments, cheerful voices echoing through the courtyard. They were polite, full of energy, and eager to share their music with the sisters. As they set up their equipment, one of them noticed the old piano sitting in the corner of the chapel. He laughed softly and said it looked more like a museum piece than a working instrument. The others joined in, joking that it probably wouldn't survive a single song. Sister Agnes, who had been arranging flowers near the altar, turned toward them and smiled gently. "It may be old," she said softly, "but it still remembers music." The young pianist chuckled kindly and said, "Oh, sister, I'm sure it's seen better days. Maybe you used to play back then?" She nodded. "A long time ago." He smiled again, a little amused. "Well, maybe you'll play for us later." His tone was light, but she could hear the teasing underneath. When the concert began, the chapel filled with warm notes from guitars, violins, and a small electric keyboard the visitors had brought with them. The music was lively, and the sisters clapped along with joy. Sister Agnes sat near the back, her eyes closed, listening closely. For her, each note awakened something deep inside, something she hadn't felt in years. Her fingers twitched slightly, remembering movements long forgotten. After the concert, the young performers chatted and laughed with the nuns. The atmosphere was light and joyful. One of the younger sisters mentioned that Sister Agnes used to play the piano beautifully in her younger years. The visitors looked surprised, then curious. "Really?" one of them asked with a grin. "Maybe we should let her show us some of those skills." His words sounded friendly, but the others giggled softly. Another added, "If the piano doesn't fall apart first." Everyone laughed, and though the joke wasn't meant to be cruel, it stung a little. Sister Agnes only smiled and said, "Old things still have stories to tell." Then she quietly excused herself and went to tidy the back pews. The laughter faded quickly, but the young pianist who had first spoken noticed her calmness and felt a small pang of guilt. Still, no one said anything more. They packed their instruments, planning to leave after dinner. That night, as the convent grew silent again, Sister Agnes walked alone into the chapel. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns across the floor. The piano stood there half in shadow, looking worn but patient, as if waiting for someone to remember it. She approached it slowly and ran her fingers across the keys. A soft layer of dust clung to her fingertips. She pressed one key and a faint, uneven note echoed in the quiet room. It was cracked, but it still had life. She smiled to herself and whispered, "You still remember me, don't you?" Sitting down carefully, she lifted the lid and placed both hands on the keys. Her fingers hesitated, stiff from years of disuse. Then slowly she began to play a few simple notes. The sound was weak at first, uncertain, but with every movement her memory returned. The melody that had once lived inside her began to rise again, trembling but full of feeling. One of the younger nuns passing by the chapel stopped when she heard the faint music. Curious, she peeked inside. When she saw Sister Agnes playing, she quietly called another sister. Soon a few of them stood in the doorway, listening in silence. The music was soft, fragile, and uneven, yet it carried something no polished performance could match. It carried a lifetime of emotion. Sister Agnes didn't notice her small audience. She played as if speaking to the piano, or perhaps to God. Her eyes were closed and her face was peaceful. She remembered the first time she had ever touched a piano as a child, the way it had felt like discovering her own voice. She remembered long afternoons spent practicing, the thrill of her first small recital, and the quiet decision to give it all up when she joined the convent. It wasn't a sacrifice she regretted, but sometimes she wondered what might have been if she had kept playing. When she finally stopped, the room was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She sighed, closed the lid gently, and stood up. The small group of nuns in the doorway clapped softly. Startled, she turned toward them with a shy smile. One of them said, "Sister Agnes, that was beautiful. You should play tomorrow when the guests visit again." She shook her head modestly. "Oh no, that was just an old woman remembering old times." But the younger nuns wouldn't let it go. They insisted she had to play something for everyone. "It will make them see the beauty in what they almost forgot," one of them said. Sister Agnes laughed softly and agreed to think about it. The next morning, the visiting musicians returned briefly to pick up a few things they had left behind. One of them joked again about the old piano, saying he hoped it hadn't collapsed overnight. To everyone's surprise, one of the nuns said, "It didn't. Sister Agnes played it last night and it sounded wonderful." The group laughed at first, thinking it was just kind encouragement. But the young pianist noticed the spark in the nun's eyes. Something told him there was more to it. He turned toward Sister Agnes and said, "You really played? I'd love to hear that." She smiled gently. "Perhaps later. The piano isn't what it used to be, but neither am I." He laughed politely but felt curious. For the rest of the morning, the image of the old nun at the piano stayed in his mind. There was something about her calmness, something that hinted at a quiet strength he hadn't noticed before. As the sun rose higher, Sister Agnes walked again into the chapel. She stood beside the piano, her hand resting lightly on its edge. She knew the others might still laugh, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the music inside her was still alive. She had spent a lifetime serving others, and now perhaps it was time to share one last piece of herself. The piano waited silently, like an old friend who understood everything she couldn't say out loud. The next morning, the convent was filled with a soft buzz of activity. The visiting musicians were staying for another day to rehearse a few songs for an upcoming charity concert in town. The sisters had invited a few local children and townspeople to attend, hoping to bring a little joy to their quiet community. Everyone was busy preparing food, cleaning the courtyard, and arranging chairs inside the chapel. Sister Agnes helped where she could, moving slowly but with quiet determination. Her hands were steady as she polished the wooden benches, her thoughts far away. The piano stood in the same corner, still dusty but no longer forgotten. She couldn't help but glance at it every now and then. It was almost like it was calling to her, asking her not to give up on it again. The young musicians began to rehearse in the chapel. Their laughter echoed against the stone walls, bright and full of energy. They were talented, confident, and proud of their craft, and rightfully so. But their music, though beautiful, lacked something Sister Agnes couldn't explain. It was perfect, yes, but it didn't reach the heart. When one of the younger sisters told the group that Sister Agnes might play a song later that day, the reaction was mixed. The visitors smiled politely, but there was amusement in their eyes. One of them joked that maybe she'd surprise them with an old hymn. Another said softly, "I just hope the piano makes it through." The group laughed together, but the sound carried farther than they thought. Sister Agnes was standing near the doorway and heard every word. For a moment she stopped, her gentle smile fading slightly. She wasn't angry. Instead, she felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. It was the same feeling she had when, years ago, people had told her she was too old to dream, too fragile to perform, too quiet to matter. She had thought she'd left those feelings behind long ago, but here they were again, alive and sharp. She turned away quietly and went outside into the garden. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of roses and soil. She sat on a small bench under the shade of an old oak tree. The birds were singing, and for a moment she let the music of nature calm her thoughts. She wasn't hurt because they laughed. She was sad because they didn't understand. They didn't know that behind her wrinkled hands and slow steps was a woman who had once lived and breathed music. A young nun joined her after a while. She sat beside her and said softly, "You should play, sister. They don't know what you can do. Show them." Sister Agnes smiled. "My dear, I don't need to show anyone anything. I just wish people would see that age doesn't steal your soul. It only hides it for a while." The younger nun took her hand and said, "Then let them see your soul." That afternoon, the small crowd began to gather in the chapel for the rehearsal. The visitors tuned their instruments while the sisters prepared tea and bread for everyone. The piano, still in its corner, stood like an old soldier ready for one last battle. As the rehearsal began, the young pianist, the same one who had teased the night before, took his place at the electric keyboard. His fingers danced over the keys with ease. He played fast, confident, perfect. The crowd clapped. He was proud but not arrogant. He genuinely loved music. But when his eyes met Sister Agnes's from across the room, he felt something strange, like she could see right through him. After a few songs, the young nun who had spoken to Sister Agnes earlier whispered to the visitors, "Would you let Sister Agnes try the piano for a moment?" The group looked at each other. One shrugged. "Of course, if she wants to." But another said with a grin, "That old piano? It might not even be in tune. Maybe she'll play a few notes and it'll fall silent again." There was laughter, harmless, light-hearted laughter, but enough to make the air feel heavy. Sister Agnes heard it all, though she didn't show any sign of hurt. She walked toward the piano slowly, her steps quiet but certain. The crowd went silent as she approached. The young pianist stepped aside politely, trying not to look embarrassed. She sat down carefully, her back straight, her hands resting gently on the keys. The piano looked older than ever beside her, two forgotten souls sharing one last moment. She pressed a key. A dull sound came out, then another. The tone was uneven and a few keys stuck. Some people exchanged glances, unsure if this would go well. She smiled faintly and said, "It still remembers." Then she began to play. At first it was simple, just a few slow notes forming an old melody. The sound was rough, uneven, but something about it felt different. There was warmth in it, emotion that filled the cracks where perfection couldn't reach. The laughter that had filled the room minutes ago disappeared. Everyone watched in silence. As she continued, the music grew stronger, fuller. Her fingers, though thin and lined with age, moved with surprising grace. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story, one of time, love, faith, and loss. Every note carried a memory. The walls of the chapel seemed to breathe with her music. The young pianist stood in the corner, his expression slowly changing. He had spent years mastering technique, chasing precision and applause. But in that moment, listening to her play, he felt something he hadn't in years: humility. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply sharing a piece of her soul. When she stopped, the silence was almost heavy. No one moved for a moment. Then one of the children in the audience clapped softly, and soon everyone followed. The sound grew louder, echoing through the room. Tears filled a few eyes, not because of sadness, but because something deep inside them had been touched. Sister Agnes smiled shyly and stood up. "It's an old song," she said softly. "I used to play it for children long ago. I didn't know I still remembered." The young pianist stepped forward. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "That was incredible, sister. I'm sorry we laughed." She shook her head gently. "There's nothing to forgive, my child. You're young. You think life gives you endless chances, but someday you'll understand that even broken things can still sing." He nodded, unable to speak. Something in her words stayed with him, something that would not leave for a long time. Later that evening, the young musicians sat together outside the chapel, talking about what they had just witnessed. None of them could quite describe it. Her playing wasn't perfect, but it had something pure, something real. It had moved them in a way no flawless concert ever had. Inside, Sister Agnes sat alone at the piano again. The crowd had left, the lights were dim, and the air was still. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not to play, but to thank it. and perhaps to thank life itself for giving her one more chance to share her heart. She didn't know that someone from the audience had secretly recorded the performance on their phone. She didn't know that within days her simple act of playing a broken piano would touch hearts far beyond the convent walls. That night, she whispered a small prayer before sleeping. She didn't pray for fame or recognition. She simply thanked God for reminding her that even after years of silence, music still lived inside her. In the room next to hers, the young pianist lay awake, hearing the echoes of her song in his mind. For the first time in a long while, he realized that music wasn't just about skill, it was about soul. And that old nun, whom he had once dismissed with a laugh, had just taught him a lesson he would never forget. Outside, the night was quiet. The stars above the convent shimmered softly, as if listening to a tune the world had almost forgotten. Inside, the broken piano rested in silence, its old keys still warm from the touch of hands that had reminded it, and everyone around saw that beauty doesn't fade with age. And though no one knew it yet, that moment inside a small chapel would soon reach the world beyond its walls, a moment born of laughter, humility, and rediscovered music. A moment that would prove that even the quietest souls can astonish the world when they finally find their song again. The morning after Sister Agnes played, the convent was unusually quiet. The sisters moved through the hall softly, as if not to disturb the calm left behind by her music. Something had changed in the air, a sense of warmth, of peace. The visitors had left early for their concert in town, but before leaving, they all stopped by the chapel one last time. The young pianist, who had once laughed, stood beside the old piano for a moment. He touched the keys lightly, remembering how alive they had sounded in her hands. He looked around the empty room and whispered to himself, "She made this piano sing again." What no one knew was that one of the visitors, a quiet young man with a passion for filming, had recorded the entire moment when Sister Agnes had played the previous evening. He hadn't meant to share it widely at first. He simply wanted to keep it as a memory, something beautiful that shouldn't be forgotten. But that night, as he sat in his hotel room replaying the video, something inside him stirred. He could feel the emotion in every note, the story behind her music. Without planning much, he decided to upload it to his social media page with a simple caption: "An old nun plays a broken piano, and the whole room falls silent." He didn't expect much from it. But by the next morning, everything began to change. The video started spreading. At first, a few friends shared it. Then music pages picked it up. Within hours, it began reaching thousands of people. The comments poured in. People from different countries speaking in different languages, all saying the same thing. Her music touched them. Some said it reminded them of their own grandmothers. Others said it brought them peace. Many simply wrote, "I cried." In less than 2 days, the video had millions of views. The title, "Old Nun Plays Broken Piano and Stuns Everyone," began appearing on news feeds, television programs, and even radio shows. People wanted to know who she was, where she lived, and how such beauty could come from someone the world had nearly forgotten. Back at the convent, Sister Agnes knew nothing about it. She continued her usual chores, helping in the kitchen, tending the garden, saying her prayers. When the Mother Superior called her into the office, she thought it was about some routine task. But the Mother Superior's face was full of gentle surprise. She smiled and said, "My dear, do you know that people all over the world are talking about you?" Sister Agnes looked puzzled. "Talking about me? Why would they?" The Mother Superior turned the computer screen toward her. The video was playing. It showed her sitting at the old piano, her hands moving gracefully over the keys, her eyes closed. The sound, though imperfect, filled the tiny speakers with warmth. Beneath the video were thousands of comments, thousands of hearts and words of love. Sister Agnes watched quietly for a long moment. Then she smiled softly and said, "Oh dear, I was only playing for him." The Mother Superior laughed warmly. Perhaps that's why it touched so many hearts. Within a week, reporters began calling the convent. News vans appeared at the gates and journalists politely requested interviews. Letters arrived from every corner of the world, from people who said her music had comforted them, healed them, reminded them that beauty and faith still existed in a tired world. Some sent photos of their own pianos, promising to play again after years of silence. Sister Agnes was overwhelmed. She didn't understand fame or attention. She only knew the quiet rhythm of prayer and service.
"Why do they want to talk to me?"
She asked one of the younger sisters. "I'm just an old woman who played a few broken notes." But that was exactly what made people love her. One afternoon, a news crew was allowed into the chapel to film a small interview. The young reporter asked her gently, "Sister, how does it feel to know that millions of people have watched your performance?" She looked thoughtful for a moment and said, "I'm happy if it brought someone peace. Music is not about showing off. It's a way of speaking when words are not enough. When I play, I am not performing, I am praying." Her words struck a chord with everyone who heard them. That short interview was shared just as widely as the original video. People wrote things like, "Her words are as beautiful as her music," and "She reminds us what true art is." Soon, musicians and composers from around the world began reaching out. Some wanted to send her instruments. Others wanted to collaborate or invite her to play at concerts. She politely refused most invitations, saying she was too old to travel. "Besides," she would smile, "the chapel has better acoustics than any concert hall." But one invitation caught her attention. It came from a group of music students who wanted to visit the convent to learn from her. They didn't want lessons in technique or performance. They wanted to understand how to play with heart. When the group arrived, the small chapel filled once again with youthful laughter and curiosity. They asked her questions: how she felt music, how she kept her hands steady despite her age, how she managed to play with such emotion. She told them, "When you touch the keys, don't think about impressing anyone. Think about what story you want to tell. Music must come from truth, or it means nothing." The young pianist who had laughed at her earlier returned as well. He brought flowers and a small gift, a new set of strings for the old piano. When he handed them to her, he said quietly, "You taught me something I never learned in all my years of training." She smiled kindly. "And what is that?" He looked down at the piano, then back at her. "That music without soul is just noise." She nodded gently, her eyes full of kindness. "Then promise me you'll never forget that." He did. And from that day on, his music changed too. People who had known him before said his performances felt different, more honest, more alive. He often spoke about her during his shows, saying, "An old nun taught me that even a broken piano can speak if you listen with your heart." Meanwhile, the video continued to spread. It reached countries Sister Agnes had never even heard of. People began writing songs inspired by her. Artists painted her portrait. One filmmaker even started working on a short documentary about her story. But for her, life remained the same. She still woke early to pray, still helped in the garden, still swept the chapel floor. Sometimes, when the day grew quiet, she would sit by the piano and play softly, just for herself and for God. The younger sisters often gathered around her when she played. Some closed their eyes and smiled. Others recorded small clips, though she always asked them not to make a fuss. "Let the music be enough," she'd say, and yet every time she played, more people somehow heard about it. A new video clip would surface online, and the world would fall in love with her all over again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the chapel in warm light, Sister Agnes sat alone at the piano. She began to play the same melody she had played that first night, the one that had started it all. Her fingers trembled a little, but the notes were soft and steady. The broken keys still cracked here and there, but that only made the song more real. A young nun stood quietly by the doorway, watching her. When the music ended, she asked softly, "Sister, do you ever wish you had played for the world earlier when you were young?" Sister Agnes smiled, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "No, child. I wasn't ready then. I had to live, to love, to lose, to understand what the music truly meant. Only now do I play it right." Outside, the bells rang for evening prayer. The music faded into silence, but in that silence, something beautiful remained. A kind of peace that lingered in every corner of the chapel. And though Sister Agnes never chased fame, the world continued to chase her story. People everywhere were reminded that talent has no age, beauty needs no stage, and the heart never forgets how to sing. What began as a quiet moment in a small convent had become a global reminder of hope. And Sister Agnes, the humble nun who simply wanted to play a broken piano, had unknowingly played a tune that reached the soul of the world. The convent had never been so full of letters, calls, and kind visitors. Each day, new envelopes arrived from around the world. Some had drawings of pianos. Others were written in languages the sisters couldn't even read. People sent gifts, handmade rosaries, tiny wooden crosses, thank you cards covered with colorful hearts. But Sister Agnes never looked at any of it as fame. She saw it as kindness, people responding to something good, something honest. She didn't use social media or own a phone. Most of the time, she didn't even know who was writing to her. The younger sisters read the letters aloud in the evenings after prayer. Some were from young musicians who said they had quit music years ago, but picked it up again after watching her play. Others were from lonely people who said her song made them feel less alone. A few even came from hospitals where nurses played her video for patients who couldn't sleep. Every message touched her deeply. "It's amazing," she said softly one night. "All I did was play a few old notes, and it reached hearts I've never met." Music really is its own kind of prayer. The world, however, was not done with her story. Television channels and newspapers from different countries wanted to meet her. A well-known orchestra even invited her to perform at a charity event for elderly musicians. The Mother Superior showed her the letter and asked, "Would you like to go, sister? They say it's a beautiful hall and the concert will be broadcast to millions." Sister Agnes smiled gently. "I am not meant for bright lights or big halls. My music belongs here in this quiet place, but if it helps others, I can try." The other nuns were excited. They helped her prepare, ironing her simple habit and polishing her old rosary beads. She didn't have fancy shoes or jewelry, and she refused to buy any. "Let me go as I am," she said. "If people come to see me, let them see truth, not decoration." When the day came, a small car picked her up. For most of the journey, she gazed out the window, watching the countryside roll by. The fields looked golden under the sunlight, and the sky seemed endless. She whispered a small prayer of thanks, not for fame, but for the chance to share her gift one more time. The concert hall was grand, with shining floors and rows of golden lights. When she stepped inside, everyone turned to look. Some smiled in admiration, others in disbelief. She looked so small and fragile standing there, yet there was something powerful in her calmness. The organizers greeted her kindly, but they worried the large crowd might overwhelm her. She simply said, "If I can play in front of God, I can play anywhere." Backstage, a group of musicians practiced their pieces. They were all professionals, young, confident, and skilled. Some of them whispered among themselves, wondering how an old nun could perform after so many years. A few even doubted she'd managed to finish a song. But there was one man who didn't laugh. The young pianist who had once mocked her stood among them, waiting for his turn to perform too. When he saw her, he walked over and bowed slightly. "It's good to see you again," he said quietly. "I still play your melody sometimes." Sister Agnes smiled. "Then you understand what it means now?" He nodded. "I do. I came here to hear you again." She placed a hand on his shoulder gently. "Then listen not with your ears, but with your heart." When it was her turn, the lights dimmed slightly and a quiet hush filled the hall. The stage crew had placed an old wooden piano at the center. Not polished or perfect, but simple and full of character, much like her. The audience didn't know what to expect. She walked slowly to the piano and sat down. Her fingers rested on the keys for a moment. The hall was so still that one could hear the faint rustle of her robe as she adjusted her seat. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, trembling, yet they carried across the hall like a whisper that everyone strained to hear. The melody grew warmer, deeper, more alive with every passing second. It wasn't grand or complex, and it was human. It spoke of time passing, of loss and love, of patience and faith. The people in the audience leaned forward. Many of them had spent years attending concerts, hearing perfect performances by world-famous musicians. But this was different. This was not performance. It was confession, prayer, and storytelling all in one. Her eyes stayed closed as she played. Her hands trembled slightly, but the music flowed effortlessly. Each note had weight. Each pause had meaning. It was as if the piano itself was breathing again, carrying her memories out into the world. By the time she reached the final note, the entire hall was silent. For a moment, no one clapped. It was not because they didn't like it. It was because they didn't want to break the spell. Then slowly people began to stand. One by one they rose from their seats until the whole audience was on its feet, clapping with tears in their eyes. Sister Agnes didn't bow or soak in the applause. She simply smiled, folded her hands, and whispered a quiet thank you to the piano before standing up. The young pianist in the wings had tears running down his face. He turned to one of the other performers and said, "That wasn't a concert. That was a blessing." Afterward, reporters asked her how she managed to play with such emotion. She answered, "Because I no longer play for myself. I play for those who have forgotten their song." Her performance became the highlight of the event. Clips of it were shared everywhere: television, newspapers, and social media. People called her the nun who healed the world with music. But she never let the attention change her. When asked if she wanted to travel and perform more, she shook her head. "My home is enough. Let others take the stage now. I have played my song." When she returned to the convent, the sisters greeted her with joy. They hugged her, offered her tea, and asked about everything: the lights, the people, the applause. She laughed softly. They were kind, she said. But the best sound was still the quiet after the last note. From that day on, people continued visiting the convent. Some came to meet her, others just to sit in the chapel where she first played. Many said they felt peace there, even if they didn't understand why. Sometimes she would sit with them, talk a little, then play a few notes. Never long, never loud, just enough to fill the air with calm. Years passed. The viral videos and headlines faded, as all stories do, but her music never did. Children who had once seen her video grew up remembering it. Musicians who had mocked her later dedicated their art to her message. Even strangers who had never met her said her melody still played in their hearts whenever life felt heavy. One quiet afternoon, she sat alone in the chapel again. The piano had been repaired a little. The keys were smoother now, the sound clearer, but it still had its old spirit. She began to play the same melody that had once made her famous. The light from the stained glass windows fell across her hands, making them glow softly. Her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer as she played. When she finished, she didn't open her eyes right away. She just smiled and whispered, "Thank you for letting me play until the end." Outside, the world went on, full of noise, movement, and distractions. But somewhere inside that quiet convent, one old nun and one old piano reminded anyone who listened that beauty never fades with time. It simply waits to be heard again. That night, as the moon rose high and bathed the chapel in silver light, a gentle breeze passed through the open window, carrying with it the faint echo of her song. The same song that had traveled across the world, touched countless hearts, and reminded everyone that sometimes even the humblest hands can create miracles. And though she didn't know it, her performance at the concert hall was being replayed on television once more, years after it first aired. A little girl somewhere across the ocean sat watching it with her mother. When it ended, she turned and said softly, "Mom, I want to play piano like her." In that small sentence, Sister Agnes's music lived on, not just as a memory, but as a beginning. The years passed quietly at the convent, but the story of Sister Agnes and her piano never truly faded. People still remembered the videos, the concerts, and the warmth that had come from a small chapel in a quiet corner of the world. Visitors continued to come, some to meet her, some just to see the piano where the miracle had first begun. The convent had grown busier than before, not because of fame, but because of the hope that people felt when they walked through its doors. Sister Agnes, of course, remained humble. She never sought attention, nor did she care about recognition. Each morning she rose early, tended the gardens, said her prayers, and helped the younger sisters with their work. But she always found a moment in the day to sit at the old piano. Sometimes it was just a few notes, a melody from years ago. Sometimes it was a longer song that carried the stories of her life, the joys, the sorrows, the quiet moments that had shaped her. One day, a letter arrived from a school in a distant city. A music teacher had shown her students the video of Sister Agnes playing the broken piano. The children were inspired and wanted to know if she could visit their school to play for them. The Mother Superior looked at the letter and smiled. "Do you want to go, sister?" she asked gently. Sister Agnes paused. Traveling was difficult and she was no longer young. But then she remembered the children who had watched her video and felt something awaken inside her. "If it helps them find joy," she said softly, "then I will go." Preparations began, and a small car was arranged to take her to the school. The sisters helped her pack a few belongings, and she carried her small rosary, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. For the first time in many years, She traveled outside the convent with the purpose of sharing her music with strangers who might never have heard it otherwise. When she arrived at the school, children ran to greet her. Their eyes were wide with curiosity and some were shy, holding their hands together nervously. She smiled at them, her face glowing with warmth. "Hello, children," she said softly. "I hear you love music." The classroom was set up with a small piano that had been carefully chosen for her. It wasn't perfect. There were a few keys that didn't quite work, and the wood had scratches from years of use. Sister Agnes knelt slightly and ran her fingers over the keys. "It doesn't have to be perfect," she said. "It only has to sing." When she began to play, the children watched in awe. The notes were simple but full of feeling. Some children closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others tried to mimic the movements of her fingers. The sound was imperfect in places, but that only made it more real. Each key that produced a slightly cracked tone seemed to carry a story, a memory, a lesson in patience and beauty. One young girl in the front row whispered to her friend, "It's like the piano is alive." The friend nodded, eyes wide. "And so is she." After the song ended, the children clapped and cheered. Sister Agnes smiled and bowed her head slightly. She didn't say much, her music had already spoken. But she spent the next hour talking to the children, answering their questions and showing them that music was not about speed, technique, or perfection. It was about feeling. It was about telling stories with your heart. Word of the visit spread quickly. Soon other schools invited her. Some asked her to play at charity events, while others asked her to speak to children about the importance of following their passions, no matter their age. She agreed to some, but politely refused others. She wanted her music to remain genuine, not forced by obligations. Back at the convent, life continued as usual, but it was richer somehow. The younger sisters often sat with her as she played, learning to understand music as more than just notes on a page. They learned that every tremble, every pause, and every soft key had meaning. They learned that patience and love could be found in the quietest sounds, and that even a broken instrument could carry beauty. One evening, a letter arrived from a world-famous orchestra. They invited her to play at a charity concert to raise funds for underprivileged children who had never owned a musical instrument. They promised to prepare everything carefully: a piano in perfect condition, comfortable seating, and a respectful audience. The Mother Superior showed her the letter and asked, "Would you consider it?" Sister Agnes thought for a moment. She had already traveled and shared her music with children who needed hope. But this was different. If she could help children who had never even seen a piano, then it was worth it. She nodded softly. "Then we will go." The concert hall was massive, filled with people who had heard of her story but had never seen her. Cameras lined the edges of the stage and the sound system was carefully adjusted. Yet when she sat down at the piano, she did not let the grandeur distract her. She closed her eyes, let her hands rest on the keys, and began to play. The hall was filled with music that seemed to stretch beyond the walls. Every note carried warmth, every pause carried thought. The children in the audience were mesmerized, some whispering to their neighbors, "Listen, it's like she's telling a story." Adults were equally captivated. Many had tears in their eyes. It was not a performance in the traditional sense. It was a gift of love, hope, and inspiration. By the end of the concert, people rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Reporters called it the most touching performance of the year. The orchestra's director approached her and said softly, "Sister, you have done something extraordinary. You have reminded everyone why music matters." She shook her head gently. "I did nothing extraordinary. I only played what was in my heart." When she returned to the convent, she found letters waiting from children she had never met. Some sent drawings of pianos. Others sent letters describing how they had started to practice music again because of her. A few even sent recordings of themselves playing, timid, shaky, but full of hope. She smiled and listened to each one carefully. She never judged. She simply encouraged. In the evenings, she would sit by the piano in the chapel, playing softly as the sun set. The light from the stained glass windows danced on the keys, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. She played for the convent, for the children who had written to her, for anyone who needed to hear beauty in a quiet place. The younger sisters often joined her. They learned to play in a new way, not just to perform, but to express, to tell stories, to connect. They began teaching children at the convent in the same way. Soon the chapel was often filled with soft music, laughter, and learning. Even as she grew older, her hands moved over the keys with care and emotion. Age had made them slower but not less expressive. She reminded everyone that it was not speed or precision that mattered, but love, patience, and courage. Eventually, her story became a symbol. Books were written, videos were shared, and teachers used her example to show children and adults alike that it was never too late to follow a passion. People spoke of her as an inspiration, but she never sought praise. She simply played quietly and faithfully, sharing the gift she had been given. One quiet evening, as she played alone in the chapel, a young nun asked, "Sister, do you ever wish you had shared your music sooner?" Sister Agnes smiled softly, her hands resting on the keys. "No, my child. I needed the years to understand what music truly means. It is not about applause. It is about love. It is about giving, not receiving, and now my music can reach hearts I could never have imagined." The sun set slowly, casting golden light through the windows. Outside, birds sang as if joining her melody. Inside, the piano echoed softly with memories, hopes, and prayers. In that quiet, small convent, an old nun and a broken piano had reminded the world of something timeless. That music, love, and faith are not limited by age, and that even the quietest soul can leave a lasting mark on the world. And so Sister Agnes continued to play. Her music traveled farther than she could see, touching hearts she would never meet. It inspired children to pick up instruments, adults to remember lost dreams, and people everywhere to believe in the simple power of one kind and determined soul. Even after she was gone, the sound of her piano continued to echo in the hearts of those who had heard it, a reminder that beauty never fades. It only waits for someone patient, gentle, and brave enough to let it be heard. In the end, the old nun who had once been blocked from playing found her voice. She had astonished the world not with speed or perfection, but with truth, humility, and love. And that truth, carried in a melody played on a broken piano, would inspire generations for years to come.